So, moving on to kind of like a new playlist, as I mentioned, and to kind of wonder about what can precipitate a new idea. For me, it was being in a rut for a very long time. Kind of wondering if I journal and I just write out my ideas, what will I kind of be able to kind of just almost withdraw from my brain that is maybe in my subconscious and I'm not really thinking about, but just almost allowing my mind to rest and almost saying, I'm just going to mindlessly write and see what I allow myself to think. So I remember back in probably 20, let me say 2015, 2016. It's always in the middle of elections or during elections where there's always this big hype about, smear campaigns, mudslings, like, all these, I don't know if to call it entertainment or what it is, but anyway, around politics, there's always something that's kind of contentious and everyone's talking about. Nobody knows what the validity is, and oftentimes I don't think anybody really bothered too much. So for some reason, I think I'm just built this way that anything that's contentious or looks like unpopular, I just kind of gravitate towards it. So I remember at the time, thinking about one of the popular speakers that I liked listening to, more for spiritual insight than anything, because this was someone who studied with traditional scholars. And I thought it would be really cool if whatever like president was elected, because they were known to be somebody who understood business and just kind of like what the entertainment world was like. If they actually got elected and had people around to support, um, who may have some kind of understanding of what role tradition plays in the contemporary world. So I used to kind of just pray that in my mind, like in my mind, I'm just kind of curious about this. And at the time, it was just like a passing thought. And so elections came and went, and then new elections happened, and people weren't really happy with like everything. There's always this disillusionment because we know that the whole process of change is like more than just 4 years long. It takes a very long time. So I used to think about how sometimes people will say, if it wasn't for um, this person would have stayed in line, for example. But that's just dogma. Like it's really just saying we wish we could have continued this tradition instead of saying maybe this is a big sign to say that we've outlived tradition and we have to move on. It's basically what prophets do, right? They come with these massive signs, like new doctrine sometimes. And it's almost to say, okay, like we've had a long time with this way of thinking. Now it's time to move on. And we never think that way. We're always so resistant to change. It's almost baffling that we haven't, like maybe we're coming to terms with this again. And it's just part of the zeitgeist where, we're so used to this political climate, a religious climate, like a certain tradition, a certain way of doing things that change on such a large scale kind of scares us. And we'd rather do it gradually, which is actually more healthy because then it doesn't cause like tremors in communities. And uh, and so uh basically this is kind of what like I think I mentioned in one of my videos where I never used to thought I'd be somebody who could um be an entrepreneur. I always thought of myself as, I like my quiet life. Like I like things being very predictable. I don't like a lot of fluctuations just because my nervous system, I'm an introverted person. So anything that's sudden and isn't already kind of planned and that I can expect, I'm sort of hesitant to think about unless I've thought about it and then I'm willing to engage in it. So this kind of explains why, like, the general population likes to be informed, right? So I'm going to begin this sort of playlist by kind of wondering with you, like, what is a something akin to writer's block in a person's life? Sometimes people call it a midlife crisis, where you think, in my age growing up, there's like a almost set way of doing things, and if you kind of don't do it in that way, it's almost like, well, why aren't you? What's wrong with you? Now, in today's age, like if I was to look at maybe what the general population who's 18 is doing, they may not have that kind of restriction on them. They may just be like given a lot of leeway where it's just do what you want, and if something resonates with you, follow it and see what happens. So it's almost like this could be an aligning where these 18-year-olds are allowed to do whatever they want out of high school. For example, like there's so many more options with building an online business, with taking some time off and traveling. And it could be aligning with someone who's my age, maybe in their 40s, who's having a midlife crisis and is almost like at a point where I want to reassess like everything I've done for the past 20 years and wonder why that's the pathway I chose. So I'm writing this as like a writer's block or as kind of like an initiation into like freedom, as it were, because like you're done high school, maybe you're taking some time off before starting post-secondary education, or maybe that's not even something that you're considering. You're just thinking, I could become an entrepreneur and I could do just fine. So I'm trying to understand what is it that we understand about time. Because if we almost don't put a time limit on, I have to get this much done because by this age I want to have this accomplished. But if we think of it long term as I could live up to 90 years old and I could actually age really well and I don't really have to worry about, having a certain milestone accomplished at a certain age. Milestones are something that we usually measure developmental kind of stages when we're younger, right? Because it's almost like we wanted to make sure that children are kind of meeting developmental goals. And even that now has kind of shifted where we're letting children develop in their own time. We're understanding a lot of new learning styles. So a lot of these almost structured and concrete ways of thinking that were almost becoming standardized are now becoming relaxed again, which is kind of a relief because there's nothing worse than a parent thinking, my child's having so much fun and I enjoy learning with them, and then define that, well, they haven't met this developmental goal by this age. And then you think, I'm now becoming stressed, and then my kid picks up on that stress and they're already building their self-esteem around I'm different in some way or I'm not normal. But for them, they're their own normal. So then it's already kind of creating a stigma that we don't really want to start building in a child anyway. So how do we inspire some kind of creativity or like realigning with who we are outside of what we were socialized? That was a question that I had, and that was basically what kind of got me interested in going into family relations and human development after I took some time off from studying the hard sciences. So I went into early childhood education first, and then from there, it was while I was studying, I thought, well, if I become a parent later on in life, like I can't go wrong with what I've learned here or what I am learning. Just understanding how to build healthy psychology around child development. And then in that, while studying there, I actually learned a lot about what I was socialized to become and how I was socialized and what a sort of normal is. So if you study statistics, it tends to explain what a normal curve is, which is like you'll have on each end of a population, like these sort of like small number of populations who are almost, you can say like exceptionalities to what the average is, right? It doesn't have to be value ridden. It may not be any better or worse. It's just there's a small number on each end, and then the majority of people fall somewhere in the middle. So at the time, I used to think my normal for a woman was, go to school, understand how the world works, and then have kids. And then because you want to understand how to raise your kids, you almost want that you've had a little bit of education so that you can relate to your kids. Now I'm thinking, and even having done that, it's still going to be, well, I'm already behind. If I'm not keeping up as I'm raising my kids and almost understanding what the contemporary world is doing for the age group that I'm working with, like, and what the expectations are, there's still going to be that gap. So how do I bridge that gap? So women's studies was something that I was originally going to talk about, but I don't know if I want to kind of keep it separate like that, because there are a lot of single parents. I know when I was actually doing my ECE back in 2005, there was a single dad there who had, I think, a daughter who was just born. And so I don't want it to seem like I'm almost keeping like a group of the population out, but I also don't want to make it feel like we can be that gender fluid, because I don't want to fall into the trap where I can assume that what one person can do, another person can or can't do. And we have to kind of understand what kind of intrinsic differences are there and just celebrate them rather than feeling like we have to compete around them in any way. So I used to think that I would be somebody who would be kind of like a life coach, where I'd want to start an online business and maybe just help coach people through these almost ruts that they find themselves in, maybe for a month, maybe for 2 months, and then almost allow myself to be somebody who can refer. So, if I have like a Facebook following or people that I'm following who are professionals in the community, then, if I find that some of the people that I'm coaching require some additional support, I can say, maybe I can refer you to this professional and they can have the resources to help you and, continue with you on the goal that you're working on. And then in the meantime, I don't mind being kind of like a friend or a sounding board that's kind of more informal, um, and just kind of go from there. And then I started to wonder about like what, so this is for like an age gap right now. So let's say 18 to maybe 50 or 60, right? So this is like kind of a population that's very varied and they could be on a massive spectrum of like different goals and different places in life. And then I started thinking like, okay, what if I take a proactive approach and think proactively? So let's think of kids right now who are 13 and they're thinking about when they turn 18. So then they think, when I have the free time to be independent, what would I want? And then those who are 18 would think in the future, thinking, if I was to have kids from now, what would my ideas be? And then those who are without kids would say, if I want to continue on with my life without having kids. So it's almost like breaking down these expectations that we would follow a certain pathway, sort of reinforced. So if I'm expected that, I'm going to have a kid and then I decide I don't want to, there isn't an expectation that I have to always have an answer for why don't you have kids? Or if I choose not to have a relationship or like a traditional relationship, like why is it? People are curious and sometimes they want to know because that's what diversity is. But it's not, I hope it wouldn't be a kind of questioning in the line of like, why are you different? Where it's kind of like chastising or making a person feel bad about themselves, but instead of kind of like curious, like, wow, you're doing things differently. Like, tell me what kind of precipitated this for you. And in that way, it becomes a lot more engaging when people are willing to talk about their experience and they don't feel like they're going to be judged about it. So if you have that kind of proactive approach, it's almost like you're now becoming a proactive person who wants to build a certain life rather than almost having these circumstances kind of fall upon you and you're just kind of working with them because like, well, this is just kind of what fell into my lap and I have to kind of figure out how to deal with it. So the way this kind of happened to me was when I was, I think it was like in my mid 30s, so a few years back. I started to feel that my body was not really metabolizing sugar in a very healthy way. So I started to get really, really warm. Like my body would kind of get fevered in a little bit, in some areas around my feet, especially. Sometimes I get like almost this numb, tingly feeling. And I used to feel remorse because I had tried the keto diet for a little bit, and I was wondering if maybe like I had too many saturated fats, and because I'm like a sugar fiend, like it was maybe like just very unhealthy way for me to be eating. That's not really balanced. So then I wondered if I had somehow just messed up like my blood, like just the way my blood is in my body. So then I was thinking, man, I wish I had known that. Like, you have to be careful when you try some of these diet plans, that some of them are meant to be temporary. They're not supposed to be long term, for one. Second of all, if you already have a history, like in my family, we have a history of diabetes. So if you have a history of that, you should already kind of be careful with your eating habits because some of these are genetic. And so in my mind, I was like, man, because it was so uncomfortable. Like it became really tricky for me to eat anything. Anything that I ate, my body just felt like it was swollen, like it was just extra water everywhere. And I was like, how do we get rid of, like, it's just a very unhealthy feeling. And so I thought it would be kind of nice if we, from a young age, understood some of the adult illnesses that we can kind of almost grow into because of our habits, our daily habits. And then what can we do to prevent it? So taking in that preventative measure just brings awareness. And so then we're just more alert and more informed. Like if they teach these life skills in school, sometimes we think of that like later on in life. Or like we didn't learn this in high school or in grade school. This would have been really useful. And so understanding, why, having a diet that is rich in vegetables and maybe like fruit. And then you have like the extra foods. We don't have to call them junk food anymore. It just allows us to think of it as it's still okay in moderation. Like we read about this passively. But if we think about, well, what happens when we don't do that? Then we understand the why of everything. Because that's what kids, we know as toddlers, like everything's always why. Like you don't do this, why? This happens this way, why? Right? Because it's almost like it satiates that curiosity within us that almost allows us to think creatively. So if you say, if you eat this kind of food only and you don't exercise, then when you grow up, you're not going to be allowed to eat these foods at all. And if you do, you're going to have to take this kind of medication and it might make you really sleepy. And then they'll think, oh, and then they'll think creatively, like, well, what if I eat this kind of food and I do this for like for fun to kind of burn off the extra sugar in my body? So in this way, they're engaging with life with awareness, and it just creates a very can-do attitude about life. So that's kind of what I want to begin with. And I used to call this like a life specialist, where when I was doing my ECE, they used to call a life specialist somebody who works at a hospital uh, with children who are almost in need of that kind of positive support in life, because just being constantly hooked up to machines or having to take medication, it takes kind of like this toll on your perception of life. And a life specialist is meant to complement that kind of medical experience of life with some kind of entertaining life that's, there's other things that we can do. You don't have to be trapped in this hospital room and just feel like you're just dealing with doctors all the time. So I kind of built on that, where a life specialist, yeah, it has that element to it, but why don't we become our own specialist? Because a specialist is basically somebody who knows something really well, that's what they specialize in. Like, you ask them anything about it and they'll be like, they can just like the back of their hand, they know it. They're like, yeah, oh, yeah, yeah, and then just everything's familiar to them. So if we understand what our learning style is, what are healthy habits to have throughout life, like with exercise, with eating, social skills, like what's a mental habit that's really healthy, how do I overcome like maybe habits that are not very healthy, all of these things almost seem like givens as we're adults. Like, yeah, why don't we know this almost, right? So if you are learning this as a part of like a curriculum, like in school, it's just kind of like life skills, like they have in the Montessori education, you become someone who appreciates going to school and the value of education, the value of like lifelong learning, and you build your life in a way that doesn't feel like I don't like my life. So if you're building it as I'm building a life that I want to live, then it just takes the pressure off of everyone. Like, it takes the pressure off of parents who feel like they kind of somehow live vicariously through their kids. Like, if my kids don't meet these certain standards, I have to deal with the pressures of my community, my parents, society. Like, who knows when I go back home? We have all these pressures that we're kind of outgrowing now, where sometimes it used to be, if you don't work in these professions, then, it's almost like, you don't have the prestige of this person. I think we've outgrown a lot of that with the more enlightening ways of creating niches in the world that are focused around education, around entertainment. So the traditional ways of learning have kind of sort of branched out to a lot more subjects and field of study. So with being a life specialist, then it becomes something that we want for ourselves, and because we appreciate that kind of uniqueness in ourselves, we'll want to almost branch out and understand more about others. So if we start with understanding our own uniqueness, maybe that'll help us understand why diversity is such an essential thing, and we'll maybe be more willing to build bridges even within certain communities. So that's one of the things I want to stress right now is um, just building a broad stroke and saying all Muslims for me was something I was almost like, yeah, I mean, it makes sense, but it doesn't, because you'll have people who will say, I'm Muslim but I drink, I'm Muslim but I date, I'm Muslim but I do drugs, I'm Muslim but, and instead of saying that, it's I believe in monotheism as a worldview, and I don't mind trying some of these contemporary popular culture habits, maybe, or qualities or characteristics. So in that way, we don't always feel like we're apologizing, because think of that, if you're always apologizing for who you are, it almost feels like you're already trying to meet a standard and you don't even know who set the standard and who you're trying to please. So then it just becomes like, what kind of life is that? Like, when you can't fully live who you are authentically, but you're trying, and then when you do try, you have to apologize for it. So then it's just like, I think we can do better. Like, why don't we try something new and just assume, I know what makes me happy. I can be my own specialist and understand, I've tried this and it doesn't really work for me. I have tried this and I do enjoy it in moderation. Some things help me understand why I want a certain group of friends over others. And from there, we kind of build a support system that can be a little bit more long lasting, rather than these group of friends that we might have inherited just because they're our family friends, and they kind of reinforce a peer pressure or a certain kind of expectation that we sort of can't climb out of. So I'm going to start with that as kind of an intro to what I hope to be something around building yourself as a life specialist alongside the sociology of understanding our unique self as an individual, as a man or a woman, and then from that kind of spread into like what is it about wanting to understand the universe, and then not necessarily calling it God anymore, so that we're not feeling like there's like an authoritarian standard in the world or an authoritative one, and instead thinking maybe it's just a spirit that comes in and out of people's psyche, as it were, as we develop through time.